Good evening, everybody. I'm Terry Hauser, and I have the honor of chairing Agenda this season. Tonight we have a very unique, interesting, and I hope you'll find it a fun program in store. To kick things off, I'd like to introduce Thomas Booth from John Strangelove's Tavern in Medieval Madness, which is a unique perspective that kind of brings together what's happening in the libation world in Alexandria today and in medieval times. Tom.
Thank you so much, Terry. You're very kind. First of all, we're actually John Strongbows, not John Strangelove. Just want to get that part right. We are here because we represent John Strongbows. We also represent Medieval Madness. It's a little-known fact in Alexandria that Medieval Madness is the #1 business in Alexandria for bringing first-time visitors to Alexandria. We've brought 47,000 first-time visitors to Alexandria over the last 6 years. We were founded 6 years ago by 3 disabled veterans. Today, the business is still largely veteran-owned. It is, there's about 20 of them running around now. It is Medieval Madness is very much a medieval show, but it's really modern politics set into satire within the modern world. I mean within the medieval world. The tavern is a blend of ancient and modern cuisine. We have Chef Clifford Schliefer. It's unique creations, all done by the chef. He makes the whipped cream, he makes the cider we serve, he makes everything by hand. For wines, we take a special stand on wines. Both in Medieval Madness and the tavern, we only carry wines that the vineyard was actually in business before 1453. So these are great ancient wines. So for instance, Baroni Ricasoli, the families lived in the same castle making wine from the same vineyard since 1141. There's another wine called Chinon. That family's been making wine for 27 generations. They were the vintners for Henry II. For beer, we're more finicky. We do carry some local brews that have a heritage behind them. We do carry we import a lot of things direct from Europe. Most of the beer are ancient recipes. Forge and Port City are both beers that we carry as well. Forge has a lot of historic beers. So for wines, we have a problem, and that's that it's too expensive for these ancient wines. They just cost a lot. So what we did is we decided we wanted to get past that, and if people had great wine, they'd like the place better. So what we did is we put a grocery store markup on it. So Baroni Ricasoli that I just talked about is $31 a bottle, and I think $8 or $9 a glass with us. We wanted to make great wine affordable. The final point about us is we are the home of the arts and the handcrafted. All the furniture in Medieval Madness was handmade by North Carolina craftsmen. Our thrones were hand carved by a Texas craftsman. The walls are adorned by numerous things, all made by local craftsmen, or at least American craftsmen. The clothing that you see our ladies and myself in, they were made by a craftsman here. A seamstress was just really, really talented. So all of it handmade stuff. So we are really a feature for Alexandria crafts. We're a feature for history. We try to join history together with the modern so that people who don't like history or think they don't find themselves having fun purely by accident. And it works well. Godspeed and have a happy night. Thank you. We're very proud to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And let that be a lesson to all of you. When you write down your questions, make sure they're legible. I can't even read my own handwriting. Now, as we begin, I'd like to invite everyone to raise your glasses in a toast to the spirits of Alexandria. May they always be high. Cheers. You know, Agenda Alexandria is truly a team effort, and it begins with our Agenda Alexandria board members. They're the ones you can recognize by the red ribbons on their name tags, and I'd like to ask all the board members here tonight to please stand and be recognized. Thank you. We couldn't present our programs without the support of our wonderful sponsors for the season, starting with our hosts here at the Hermitage of Northern Virginia, and also Bittersweet, who caters our wonderful meals. This season, we have several returning sponsors, the Alexandria Chamber of Commerce and our program manager, director for this program, Sherry Bellori, is the vice president. Ann Wynn of State Farm Insurance, Barbara Anderson of Life and Estate Planning Center, David Speck of Speck Caudron Investment Group, Wells Fargo Advisors, Frank Fannin of SunTrust Bank, thank you, Frank. Donna and James Tobin, Honest Air Heating and Air Conditioning, thank you, Donna. Gant Redmond of Redmond, Peyton and Braswell, William Pollock and Charlotte Hall of the Potomac Riverboat Company, and William D. Ewell. Thank you all for your ongoing support, and we're also fortunate to welcome new sponsors this season, Katie Gilchrist of Maid Brigade. Thank you, Katie. Jerry Vernon of the Alexandria Gazette Packet, Derek Limas of Municipal Media Services, and Derek and the Alex TVs and Alex record our program, and it replays on Comcast Channel 70. We air weekly, Monday and Saturday nights at 9 p.m., and Wednesday mornings at 10 a.m. I'd also like to recognize former Governor Jim Gilmore, who is here with us this evening. Thank you, Governor. You know, Agenda's members are among the most active and involved in our city. And for those of you who currently serve on a city board, commission, or task force and have materials you'd like to share, just give them to Executive Director Sherry Brown or to any board member, and we'll see that they're placed on the resource table. For those of you who have already joined Agenda or renewed your memberships, thank you so much. If not, I'd like to invite you to please join. Membership forms are available at the welcome table, and Sherry will be more than happy to take them before you leave. And please, take a couple of forms home with you to share with friends who might be interested. We've got some great programs still coming up this season. We'll be back on the 23rd of next month to take a look at what's next for the Morant, Genon, NRG site now that the Potomac River Generating Station has finally shut down. We'll talk about what uses will replace it on this great waterfront site, when we will know what's going to happen, and who's going to decide. And on April 27th, let's spend the night together. That's not a come on. It's our hot topic for 2015. We'll be looking at Alexandria's hotel boom and asking if it's a boon or a bane. Tonight, of course, we're focused on Alexandria's Luscious Libations. And at this point, the program is organized by Russ Bailey, Rosalind Bovey, and Sherry Simmons-Bellari. And I'd like to invite Sherry to the podium to introduce our speakers.
I don't trust my handwriting either. That's why it's on my, my tablet. So, good evening. I'm Sherry Simmons-Bellori, and on behalf of my program chairs, as Terry pointed out, Rosalind Bovey and Russ Bailey, I would like to welcome you to tonight's program, Luscious Libations. Unfortunately, I got a call just a few hours ago. Todd Thrasher was unable to attend this evening due to severe illness, but he really apologizes, and he wants to make it up to us and hopes to be back and invited back again at a future date. So we wish Todd a speedy recovery and know that our two remaining panelists will provide some fascinating insights. These men really, I think you'll be thrilled with their presentation. They may have perfected drinking in these days, but drinking in Virginia goes way back. Colonial Williamsburg, colonists in Williamsburg, at least many of them, believed alcohol, and I want to get this straight, could cure the sick, strengthen the weak, enliven the aged, and generally make the world a better place. And I think that's true. Mark Hill, or at least you don't care if it's not, Mark Hill in the November 28th Carlisle House Docent Dispatch noted that at the 1758 Frederick County election for the House of Burgesses, there were 4 men who stood for election, and one of them being our own George Washington. The custom at this time, prior to the election, was for the candidates to supply the voters or the freeholders with drink and food. Colonel Washington, unfortunately, was not able to make this election due to his military obligations. So 2 of his friends, 2 Alexandrians we all know very well, John Carlisle and George Fairfax, volunteered to step in and help. They supplied over 125 gallons of assorted spirits, beer, wine, brandy, plus a barrel of rum punch. The result of the 400 votes cast the next day, 310 went to George Washington. So politicians, you just may want to keep that in mind. So speaking first this evening will be Steve Bayshore, the fascinating manager of historic trades at Mount Vernon, where he leads a small team in distilling whiskey exactly as it was done in Washington's day. Steve will be discussing the history of George Washington's distillery and its reconstruction and current operations at Mount Vernon. You be sure to visit Mount Vernon, the distillery, on your next trip to Mount Vernon, or even make it a separate trip, because it is a fascinating experience. Brewmaster Bill Butcher will speak next with his discussion of a modern brewery. Bill is a fourth-generation Alexandrian, who is truly ingrained in the fabric of this city. Bill is running Port City Brewing Company, whose business is brewing, packaging beer, and then distributing it to bars, restaurants, and groceries. I don't think I've been to a restaurant in Alexandria that doesn't serve Port City beer. But it's really so much more. You could definitely stop by there, take a tour of the brewery, or just sit in the tasting room and enjoy some of the unique brews that Bill and his team have brewed for us. So I hope you are excited as I am to hear what these experts have to say. So if you gentlemen would like to come up, and Steve, take my place at the podium, and Bill on the panel.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you tonight. Good to be indoors with the weather we've been suffering from. Good time to drink, though, right, Bill?
Indeed.
Yeah, even when it's warm, it's a good time to drink. I've been at Mount Vernon for about 8 years, and most people don't realize that in addition to all that George Washington did for the nation as a public man, as a military man, he was also an incredible entrepreneur and farmer. And late in his life, whiskey came to Mount Vernon. The interesting thing is, it was not George Washington's idea to make whiskey. In 1797, he hired a Scotsman, and it was the Scotsman's idea, and we all know the history of the Scots here in Alexandria. He hired a man named James Anderson, who had immigrated from Scotland in 1791, and he had run mills that supplied distilleries in Scotland. So he knew the business from farming on up, and one of the first letters he writes George Washington is, "Let's build a distillery by your grist mill. I can make a lot of money for you." But typical in Washington's fashion, he was a man who did his research, because at this time, Washington's just left the presidency. He's 65 years of age. He's not coming back to Mount Vernon thinking, "I'll start another business." So it took some convincing by Anderson. But Washington also was concerned about the type of people that a distillery might attract to his property. If you've been over to Mount Vernon where the mill is, it's near Fort Belvoir, right there at the end of Route 1 where you're headed toward the main entrance to Belvoir. And that Washington had 8,000 acres. A lot of people don't realize that. So all those neighborhoods around Mount Vernon were farm fields. And the farm that was most inland away from the mansion was called Dogue Run Farm, out there where the grist mill is. And the main road to Alexandria went by there. And Washington wrote a friend, Mr. Fitzgerald, he said, "I have a lot of idlers at my mill. And if I build a still house down there, will they rob the place?" So he's concerned about security, where Mr. Anderson's concerned about, we got to make money making whiskey. So Washington checked into it and realized the money's there. It's always been there in alcohol, I think. And so he agreed on a small scale to start making whiskey. So next to the grist mill, there was a building called the cooperage, and coopers are very important to beer and alcohol like we make. And he needed whiskey barrels. So Washington said, "Use the cooperage, I'll buy 2 stills." And basically he's telling James Anderson, show me the money's there, show me the market's there. Well, they sold 600 gallons the first year in 1797, right here in Alexandria. That was the main market for it. And Washington sees it's going to be profitable. So they go on and build a larger distillery and go from 2 stills to 5 stills in a building that's 75 feet by 30 feet. Which if you go out there today, it does not look like a big building, but by 18th century standards, this was a large industrial building. So this is not a farmer's still, this is not the guy in the backwoods with a shed. This is a commercial distillery, and in 1798, running 5 stills, Washington's men pumped out 4,500 gallons. Now, that's a lot. 1799, the last year of his life, do even better. They do 10,942 gallons. And in our research at Mount Vernon, we have yet to find a distillery that made more whiskey than Washington's did in 1799. So it's very interesting if you think of his history the Whiskey Rebellion, various aspects of his life. At the end of his life, George Washington was probably the largest maker of whiskey in the country. Now, he paid his tax, and we have the records of that, and we keep all those records, so we get that question a lot. But what I'd like to show you now, and we can talk some more, is a short film that was made. It's about 5-6 minutes long that shows a making of whiskey at Mount Vernon. Now, the voice may not sync well on this, so it may be a little off on tracking, but I think it'll give you a good idea.
Most folks really think
what
of
we're doing.
Washington as a general or president, not as a businessman, an entrepreneur. And when they come to learn about what he did on his own property and the fact that right after the presidency he launched this huge whiskey business, it fascinates them.
Rye should be America's distinctive spirit, not bourbon. The fact is, when the tea went overboard in Boston Harbor, that's not the only thing they threw overboard.
So most Americans, as we grew into a nation, were used to drinking rum, but after the Revolution, there's an anti-British taste in our mouths, and part of that's the taste of rum.
When they quit using rum, that didn't mean they quit drinking. It just meant that they switched over to indigenous things, and the main thing that they switched over to was rye whiskey, because that's what was prevalent.
Americans turned away from those British products, and this whiskey grain alcohol became really our drink. So the fact that George Washington decided to get into the whiskey business was not viewed as strange or unusual in any way. It was part of the American economy and a very vibrant part of it.
So the tracking's really off here, but obviously that's
There are
the tea
different
party.
perspectives on why we do this project here of making whiskey at Mount Vernon. Number one, for those of us who make it, it's an incredible opportunity as historians to be involved in doing this the real way, the old way, and we gain a lot from that, and it helps us become better historic interpreters. Secondly, it brings a lot of attention to Mount Vernon. People are interested in Washington and the whiskey story.
I'm here helping the folks at Mount Vernon operate George Washington's distillery in a manner that was appropriate for the 18th century time that it actually operated. The historical nature of it is something that really strikes a chord with me. I have an incredible sense of history, and whether I'm making it or just participating in it is a fun deal for me. In the late 18th century, the distillation equipment was essentially a piece of farm equipment. And basically every farm had a set.
The research we did indicates that there were 3,500 distilleries in Virginia alone in the late 1790s, early 1800s.
And George Washington's was no different. He had 5 farms, I think it was, on the site, and one really nice-sized distillery. Making whiskey at Mount Vernon is always a bit of a challenge because we choose to continue to use 18th century means and methods.
And it's handwork. It's lifting, carrying grain, stirring with large rakes.
Mostly it's just back-breaking manual labor. When we start out, we have to get about 30 gallons of boiling water into the mash tub. And that's accomplished by a Congo line of people that take turns dipping a wood bucket in a boiler and carting the water over and dumping it in the mash tub. And stirring the grains in is an incredibly manual procedure. We have a long-handled pole, probably 6 feet long, with some wood slats at one end to help stir. And it's very much like a rowing action. If you could imagine rowing a rowboat through oatmeal. Then we've got, again, bucket brigades to get it out of the fermenters and over to the still, bucket brigades to get it out of the still and send it over to the farm. There's just a lot of carton stuff around here that's just not done anymore in modern distilleries because of the advent of pipes and pumps.
This is the silent movie part.
I think we got a new perspective on the lives of the people that worked here in the 1790s. We run the numbers a lot and look at what we did in about 2 weeks' time, and we made about 134 gallons of whiskey. In 1799, they made 11,000 gallons, which means they had to make about 30 to 50 gallons a day.
I used to think that it was going to be random. It was going to be hit and miss. It wasn't going to be particularly good. That's why people started putting whiskey in charred barrels or running it through charcoal or making juleps, is because they're trying to knock the rough edge off of the spirit that needed its edge knocked off. But after the first round of making George Washington's rye, I came to a completely different conclusion, because by golly, I'd drink that stuff right off the still all day long.
It's good. It's good. And then being unaged, though, it's a little stronger than we're used to. It doesn't have the flavor of the barrel to it.
To be called rye whiskey, it has to touch a brand new charred barrel, even if it's new make spirit. If you want to call it whiskey, it's got to hit that new barrel.
Certainly we did it as much as we could to the methods of the 18th century, but you do have to make some adjustments in order to make everything work.
To comply with the law, we buy a brand new barrel, and we dump the alcohol in the barrel, mix it up, and dump it right back out again. There was no requirement in George Washington's time to actually throw it in a barrel, and I would assume that on occasion they sold it directly in jugs to people.
So there's certain compromises you have to make, but all that being said, it's very accurate, I think, to what Washington had, and I'm sure that if he walked in here, he might point out a few things that are a little off, but I think probably we got it pretty close, and he would probably be pleased that it's here, along with the mill, that people are learning about his businesses.
We can cut that off, Alan. That's good. So sorry the tracking was off, but I hope you could see that pretty well. And obviously, I think Dave's greatest line in that is he's our consultant. He said it's mostly backbreaking labor. And when you give tours for a living, one of the things that often happens at the distillery is you get two questions. First one is, where are the samples? You hear that 150 times a day, and you have to pretend like it's the first time you've ever heard it. And secondly, everybody thinks how great it is to make whiskey, and I'll say it is great, it's enjoyable. But by day 30 of that, you're ready for it to be over. And one of the funny stories I was telling Bill before we came up here is that one of the gentlemen that works with me, he was in his 60s, and the first time he made whiskey, he was so excited because he'd been talking about it all year, and now he got to actually do it. And on day 25, he's on top of a copper pot still with a pressure washer, cleaning all that muck out of there, and he looked at me and he said, you know, as B.B. King once said, the thrill is gone. And I think we all hit that point at some point midway through the run, but I wouldn't trade what we do for anything, because the fact that we're doing it by old methods, the fact that it's the only direct wood fire distillery in the country, and the tie to General Washington and the heritage of whiskey in early America, you know, for those of us who do this history for a living, it's something about handling it and doing it the old way that makes it a much deeper experience. Now, the biggest part about that that's difficult that you saw is bucketing that boiling water. All of us that work in there have little scars from that part of the process that we've learned, you know. It's like a blacksmith. If you know a good blacksmith, he always says, you burn yourself once and you learn. And so getting literally 110 gallons moved into those 120-gallon barrels. And then, of course, the other hard part, as Dave described, was rowing the mash. And just to give you an idea, it's more than oatmeal, because in each of those barrels, you get 99 pounds of ground rye, 57.5 pounds of cornmeal, and then 23 pounds of malt. Now, everybody wants to row malt, because malt has the enzymes in it that convert starch to sugar. So the whole process is you want to get the corn and the rye in there with that really hot water to cook the grain. You're breaking down the starches. And then after that cools for a day, you'll add your malted barley when the temperature's in the 140s Fahrenheit. And when you add malt to that, two things happen. One is liquefaction, which is that very thick malt. From rowing it in the malt, all of a sudden you get liquidy, much easier to row. And then it starts saccharification, which is sugar creation. So the whole point is to make a lot of sugar, and then you hit it with yeast, and you let the fermentation begin. So after the yeast hits that barrel, 3 to 4 days of fermentation, and then it's ready for the still. And again, as I mentioned in the film, what was amazing to us is the first few times we did this, there's always a learning curve with everything you do in life. And we really killed ourselves in 2009 and 2010 to make about 140 gallons of whiskey each time. These last two times we've done it, we make over 330 gallons of whiskey in less days and much more efficiently, so at least we're on the right part of the learning curve. But it is amazing to think of what they accomplished with 8 men in 1798 and 1799. And after those runs, we really got a deeper respect for the 6 slaves, young African-American men that were listed as distillers, and the 2 paid staff that worked in that building. Because for us, at the end of March, we clean all that up, and we get into tour mode and get ready for our season. They just started another batch. And to achieve 50 gallons a day is pretty amazing, because we know what goes into it. And again, I wouldn't trade it for the world, but you can see everybody's faces get joyful when the last few fermenters are done and the last bit of distilling's done. Now, the other part about it is you have to distill it twice at least. Excuse me. Because once through the still, they call it low wine. Basically, that first time through the still is the stripping run. You're just trying to get the alcohol that you got in there out, but it's not high enough proof for sale. So what we'll do is collect all the low wine, and we'll group it together in different proofs and run it through the copper pot still again. Second time through, this last time, we had stuff coming off 164 proof. Now, you don't want to drink 164 proof. It'll tear you up. It's real proofy. But we cut it down to 86 for bottling. And you can cut it with deionized water or distilled water to bring the proof down. So at that last part of the run, there's all the doubling. We take the low stuff, run it through again, sometimes 3 times, 4 times, because our retail shop, like any good retail shop, they just want to know how many numbers of bottles are we going to get, you know. And this last time was our best run ever. In November, we bottled 1,985 pints and set back 6 barrels for aging. So it was a good run, and we're fortunate. You know, I always say George Washington was a great man for the country, and for us at Mount Vernon today, having George Washington as your man is a good thing in many ways, because people want to buy that whiskey. And some of you know that the whiskey's not cheap. It's $95 a pint for unaged whiskey and $185 a pint for the aged whiskey. And but people are buying a piece of history. They're also buying a piece of handcrafted whiskey, which is very rare. So as you all know, there's a market out there for everything, and there's a lot of people that will line up those mornings of the sale dates and buy that whiskey. So our very first sale was in 2010, and was interesting because a lot of people were wondering how fast would it move, how would it do, and 3 hours after the store opened, it was all gone. And that's when, if many of you know Jim Reese, who was the former executive director of Mount Vernon, who sadly passed away last year. That's we got the email down, make more whiskey, yeah. And so, because when the distillery was first built, and I was there when it opened, its real purpose is education, and that's still the same purpose today. We do have school groups that come through the distillery, and we can talk about science. We don't talk about alcohol. We talk about fermentation, distillation, and the old joke at Mount Vernon is, you know, get the kids young, talk about tobacco and alcohol, you know, get them really started in the right direction. But you want to talk about the economy of the plantation is what we want to do. But we really never thought we would make whiskey there. So that's why there's a few limitations we talk about. We have to supplement extra water into the building during distillation and things of that nature. But what's I think I'm most proud of is we've gotten that building to really work. And if you tour it today and you see what I like to see is a historic building that's really been worked, like the old mill, you'll see the scars on those stills and the spent mash that's still there and the cracks in the brick. And it's probably like it looked in Washington's day. Because I remember how it looked when we first opened up. It just was too clean, you know. It happens at a lot of historic sites. I think we distort the past. Everybody was so neat in the 18th century. All the shops in Alexandria were totally clean, the warehouses. I mean, these were worked buildings. And if you've gone to Colonial Williamsburg, I think you see a good representation of that, what a workshop looks like. Now, we're going to make whiskey starting next week. We're not open to the public when we make whiskey, and I'm sorry to say that, but reason being is really safety. We've got 5 fires running, people bucketing hot water, hot copper, and so it's not conducive for tours. But we do open April 1st every year, and it's open April through October. And we do also do a whiskey dinner every year, which if you are interested in that, there's an evening tour of the distillery and then a nice dinner at the Mount Vernon Inn. So I hope you'll take time to come see Mount Vernon if you haven't been in a while, or just come to the distillery when we're open. Of course, the governor and I have already talked. He's going to come row mash next week, so we'll break him in a little bit. But I know we're going to have a question and answer time in a little bit, so I'm going to let Bill talk some because he's got a lot to say to you, and look forward to exchange with you all on any topic related to Washington. And probably maybe someone's going to ask me about the Whiskey Rebellion, I hope, because that's a question we get a lot as well. So thank you very much.
Great presentation, Steve.
Thank you, sir.
My name is Bill Butcher, and I'm the founder of Port City Brewing Company here in Alexandria. So fast forward a couple hundred years. But we did an interesting, a couple years ago, we did a beer dinner down at the Mount Vernon Estate, at the Mount Vernon Inn. It's a terrific restaurant. And before the dinner, like the little reception, we all took a walk up towards at the top of the hill as you enter into the estate. And Steve and his crew had set up a colonial brewing operation, which was really cool. It was a direct-fired kettle. You had the mash tun going, and they were stirring the mash, and it was really, really cool. And they had really captured what a colonial brewery would have looked like. So it was a really neat experience. The dinner was great, and everybody had a good time. Another thing about, we're kind of talking about history. There was a book called Capital Beer that was written by a local historian, Garrett Peck. And he chronicles the history of brewing in Washington, D.C. from the beginning of brewing in Washington, D.C. To the present day. And brewing in Washington, D.C., according to Garrett Peck, started in 1770 in Old Town Alexandria. It started down, a guy named Andrew Wales had the first brewery in this area. He brewed for the local area, for Alexandria, for D.C., but he really started brewing in this area. And his legacy lives on in the Wales Alley, down where Virtue Restaurant is now. So that's, I think, the only remaining monument to Andrew Wales. And I think he's buried in one of the cemeteries off of Route 1, one of the old cemeteries there. But anyway, Garrett does brewing history walks and talks around Alexandria, and certainly recommend checking out the book. It's very interesting. And one of the points that Garrett makes in his book is that 200 years later, after brewing in D.C. started in 1770, it started again in Alexandria with Port City Brewing Company. We just celebrated our 4th anniversary. So we opened Super Bowl weekend of 2011. And it took about 3 years to put the brewery together, to go from idea to brewing our first batch of beer. I was putting the plan for the brewery together in what may have been the worst time ever to be planning a capital-intensive business, 2008 and 2009, during the credit crisis, when banks weren't lending money, the credit markets were pretty much shut down, and I had this great idea of opening a brewery with a lot of stainless steel tanks and a lot of expensive equipment. So I worked on the plan for about the better part of a year, and then started shopping it around to banks. Figured the best place to go would be my bank where I keep my personal accounts, which was a large national bank. And they said, yeah, don't you know what's going on right now? We're not really talking to people like you. So the national banks weren't talking to startups. They wouldn't talk to businesses that hadn't been in business for up to 24 months. So I just kind of went down the list and started calling banks, saying, hey, I've got this plan. Who do I talk to at your bank about getting a loan to start this brewery? And so, like I said, the big national banks, they were not interested in talking to me. And after about 10 banks telling me no, I finally got in touch with a regional business bank based here in Northern Virginia. And they were interested in the plan, so they decided to meet with me, and they took a look at the plan and decided that this may be something that would be worth taking a look. The other thing that they suggested was that we get the Small Business Administration involved. And after being told no by 10 consecutive banks, you're pretty much ready to take whatever suggestion of a bank that is willing to talk to you to heart. But what that did by bringing the Small Business Administration in was it helped the bank spread the risk around a little bit. So the SBA takes part of it, the bank took part of it, and my wife and I took part of it as well. So it kind of spread the thing around and made it easier for the bank to be comfortable lending us money. So that's how we got started. And that worked out pretty well for us. So it took 13 weeks to build the brewery once the equipment started arriving. We're down on Wheeler Avenue, and the plan had always been to open a brewery with a tasting room. And I had been in the wine business for most of my career, for close to 20 years before getting the idea to start the brewery. I was the Mid-Atlantic sales manager for Robert Mondavi. So I represented the Mondavi family's wines from North Carolina to Pennsylvania. And so what I knew how to do was build brands in the market. I like to say that I've been selling alcohol in Alexandria since I've been old enough to sell alcohol. I grew up working in some restaurants down in Old Town, bussing tables, waiting tables, and then bartending is kind of how I grew up. And that's how I got into the wine business. I learned through working with our wine reps that you could actually make a living selling wine, and that sounded like a pretty cool thing to do. So I ended up in the wine business for 18 years. I've always enjoyed good quality beer, and I've watched the craft beer business evolve and become more and more like the fine wine business. It's the people that drink craft beer have very sophisticated palates. They're very interested in the process. They're very interested in the ingredients that we use, and they're very interested in the subtlety and the complexity of the flavors in the beers that we produce. So seeing that, it looked to me like it was becoming more and more like the fine wine business, and growing respect in the market for craft beer as well. I mentioned the beer dinner that we did at Mount Vernon. That's something that we've always done with fine wine, pairing wine and food, and a chef making a special menu. Well, restaurants are now starting to do that with craft beer, with beers that have very complex flavors and dishes that are designed specifically to go with certain craft beers. So watching that trend just kind of got my attention. And the other thing was that craft beer has grown every year since 1999. So you've got 16 years of growth in volume, in dollar volume, sales volume, and market share. And craft beer today is bigger than it's ever been, and we're still only 8% of the beer market. So I see a lot of opportunity for growth in the market. I see a lot of potential in the market. And the thing that really compelled my wife and I to move forward with this whole project was that before we opened Port City Brewing Company in Alexandria, Metro DC was the only big city in the country that didn't have a packaging microbrewery. And I tell people that, and people are incredulous, like, well, how can that be? That's impossible. You know, what about? But no, Capital City they've been around for many years, but that's a brew pub, so they're not packaging their beers for the market. Mad Fox is a brew pub in Falls Church, but again, they're not selling their beer for the market. And then we have lots of great craft beer bars, but before we opened, DC was the only top 25 metro area in the US without a packaging brewery. So we thought that if we could do something of very, very high quality, that people would give us a chance. And we've had a great response in the market since we opened. As you all know, DC is a great food and drink market, and people have very sophisticated palates, and they expect great quality. So when we started this project, it wasn't to be the best local brewery. It was to be a brewery that can compete with beer from all over the world, because we do have beers coming into this market from all over, from Belgium, from centuries-old breweries, and from cutting-edge breweries all over the US. So that's kind of how we approached this project, as trying to do something world-class from the beginning and make beer that's as good as beer from anywhere. And so far, we've had a pretty good response in the market. We have a 30-barrel brew house. So what that means is that every time we fire up the kettle, we're brewing 910 gallons of beer, and we're brewing into 60, 90, and 120-barrel tanks for fermentation. So on a brew day, we'll either brew 2 times, 3 times, or 4 times if it's a 120-barrel batch. And our biggest challenge to date has been trying to keep up with demand. Like I said, we've had a good response in the market. People like the quality of our beer, and the market, there's really not enough local craft beer in the market right now. So I contribute our success so far to the quality of the beer, and the fact that we were the first in the market. Our brewing team, our head brewer, Jonathan, has 20 years of experience. He's brewed all up and down the East Coast. He's brewed in larger breweries, he's brewed in smaller breweries, and he's done startup breweries as well. So he's been a good partner in the business, and he now has the best state-of-the-art brew house that he's ever brewed on. He has carte blanche to buy whatever ingredients he wants to buy from all over the world. And we've got a great staff. So great people, great equipment, and great ingredients really are the keys to our success so far. We were just named, Virginia we just opened our 100th brewery in the state of Virginia, which I think is pretty cool, that it continues to grow not just around here, but all over the state and all over the U.S. But we were just named Virginia Green Brewery of the Year and that was from the Virginia Department of Tourism, for our efforts in sustainability. So water conservation, other resource conservation that we do at the brewery, recycling materials, and also using local inputs when we can. Our best-selling beer is a Belgian-style wit beer. It's brewed with wheat, and I'm proud to say that it's brewed with wheat that's grown in Virginia. It's grown on the northern neck in Heathsville, Virginia, and it's great quality. And this farmer, we've been very fortunate to find him. He grows great quality wheat, and in a quantity that we can grow with him, and he can supply us what we need for our best-selling beer. So local inputs are important to us. Not just the wheat in that beer, but our bottles are made at a bottle factory in Williamsburg, Virginia, the Owens, Illinois plant that was built to service the Budweiser brewery in Williamsburg. Our labels are printed in Baltimore, and our six-packs and our case boxes are produced in Richmond, Virginia. So whenever we can, we will use local inputs. We haven't found barley in Virginia yet that is the right quality for our beer.
Doesn't Billy Dawson have barley too?
Billy Dawson
farmer, yeah.
does grow barley, and I know Copper Fox is using. That's how we met Billy Dawson. That's our farmer.
He's my
Heathsville.
farmer too.
Okay, good.
For the mill, yeah.
He's doing good stuff. His barley is good for distilling, but it hasn't been the consistency that we would want to make. We could make a very rustic style beer, but we haven't been able to find local barley that works for us. Same thing with hops. The first consideration for us with all of our ingredients is quality. And we look all over the globe for the right quality of hops. We buy British hops, we buy German hops, we buy a lot of American hops from the Pacific Northwest, from Washington State, and from Oregon. But we haven't found a source on the East Coast for hops that will give us the quality that we require. So it's quality first, and then if we can find it locally, then we certainly will. But we've been real happy with Billy Dawson at Bay's Best Feeds down in Heathsville, Virginia. So that's been terrific. Last year, our fourth year of business, we grew from 3,000 barrels of beer in our first year, which is about 40,000 cases of beer, to last year we brewed about 12,000 barrels, which is close to 220,000 cases of beer. So we're averaging 54% growth per year, which is a lot of fun. And it was interesting listening to Steve talk about George Washington and how his distillery grew and all. And we've also enjoyed very healthy growth. And that's been the biggest challenge so far, is just managing that growth. The brewers and I sit back when we have a moment and have to reevaluate our business really every 6 months, because what we were doing 6 months ago doesn't work anymore when you're growing at 54% a year. So people hear me around the brewery. One of the things that I say at least once a week to our team is that what was good enough yesterday is not good enough today, and what's good enough today is not going to be good enough tomorrow. And that type of growth is a big challenge to try to handle. And we really do have to step back every 6 months and re-examine what we're doing and just reevaluate the level of which we're ordering things and hiring people and just trying to scale up and keep up with things. But the one thing that we won't do, and Jonathan, our head brewer, and I agreed on this the very first day, we won't increase our production unless we can also increase our quality. And when you're looking at an artisanal product, a handmade product, that's very difficult to do because as production grows, normally quality necessarily has to decline in order to meet higher production. But we have decided that the only way we'll grow is that if we can also increase the quality, not maintain the quality, but actually increase it. And so what we've been doing over these past 4 years is putting in new checks in the brewing process, new tests, new quality control measures at every step of the way to ensure that we can improve the quality of the beer, increase the shelf life, increase the consistency, and also increase the complexity and the flavor of the beer. We've just hired a microbiologist, Allison Lang. She's our beer doctor. We hired her not only as a brewer, but she also set up our QC lab. So she's testing the beer, she's testing our equipment, and she's putting in new quality control checks and proactively managing quality rather than waiting until we see a problem when we've already shipped the beer out and by then it's too late. So we're trying to be proactive in the quality control as we ramp up our production. So that's really been our philosophy with growth and with quality control. This year, we continue to add capacity. We added 2 more tanks in November that gave us a 30% increase in our capacity, and that'll allow us to brew up to 16,000 barrels of beer this year. And next month, at the end of March, we'll receive 2 more tanks, which will represent another 30% increase in our capacity. So we've got room to grow. We will eventually run out of space in our brewery, which we plan on maxing out that facility over a 7-year period, and things are on track to do that. At that point, we need to decide, do we want to stay small and be happy and profitable, or do we want to keep growing? But fortunately, we're in a position that we don't have to make that decision right now. Right now, we're just focused on managing the growth and maintaining and increasing the quality and just trying to keep a good thing going. That's pretty much all I had for you. That's our story. Things are going really great. If you haven't been to the brewery, I invite you all to come visit us. We're open 7 days a week. We do tours of the brewery on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We love having people come in and taste the beer. We'll show you the process. We'll pour you a small sample of the beer right out of the tank before it's even finished fermenting, and show you every step of the process, every bit of the way. And it's a lively spot as well. We have food trucks on Fridays and Saturdays. We have live music on Friday evenings, and we do a lot of community events. There's always something fun going on. So I invite you all to come visit us. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. I bet, Bill, all those banks you went to are really sorry now. They weren't there.
Well, it's
for
funny
you.
because I get banks still calling me now, and it's many of the same banks that I called years ago, and they weren't interested in talking to me then. I'm like, where were you when I needed you?
Yeah, I bet. Well, I hope you, whatever you decide, you stay in Alexandria. I mean, you're such an important part of our city. And Steve, thank you so much. That was just fascinating. I mean, I've heard that before, and it still fascinates me to listen. So thank you so much. Well, now, folks, you have index cards or little cards in front of you, and our board members are going around collecting the questions. So I hope you have some interesting comments or questions. Let's see.
Bill, I wanted to ask you about yeast, or do you not talk about what yeast you use? Is that proprietary?
No, it's not proprietary. We use 3 strains of yeast, and that's a very important part of brewing is managing your yeast strains. Yeast is the magic straw that stirs the drink. The yeast is what starts the fermentation, and depending on the style of beer we're brewing, that determines which strain of yeast we'll use. But we have a Belgian strain of yeast that brews our wit beer, which is our best-selling beer. We have an English ale yeast, and we also have a lager yeast that brews our Oktoberfest and our summer beers.
And that's going to be critical to output, but also flavors, right?
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
We get, luckily with our distilling friends, the Distilled Spirits Council funded Mount Vernon's distillery rebuild, so we get yeast from Kentucky, and it arrives in a plain brown box. As you know, the spirits industry is very secretive about yeast.
That's interesting because a lot of industries, and the wine industry, the European wine industry is very secretive as well. American wineries, as they came to be successful, and really Mr. Mondavi, who I worked for many years, was at the forefront of just kind of opening up the doors and letting everybody see what we're doing. And so Mr. Mondavi was always very open. He would lend other vintners equipment and give them advice and trade yeast and help each other out. And the craft brewing world, we have a similar, very collaborative atmosphere, which is great. If we have a piece of equipment that breaks down, we can call our neighbors in DC, some of these other brewers, and ask them to borrow the equipment, and they can do the same for us. So we don't keep a lot of secrets, and that's, you'll see that on our brewery tour, that we let people see everything we do, and we're happy to share.
All right, we have quite a few questions up here for you all. Let's start out with Steve. Are you hiring?
Well, we just finished hiring for the season, I'm sorry to say, but usually the start of every January in this off-season, I start to bring on new staff. So better luck next year, I think.
Okay. Another question for Steve. What was the average proof of the whiskey when George Washington produced it?
That's a great question because we have to proof our whiskey to get it exact because of the legal standards that we have to go by for bottling. In the 18th century, in our ledger and the research we have, there's no listing for a set of hydrometers being at the distillery. So I have a feeling that the Scotsman and his son John, who were the two experts, and you remember this is common whiskey for the common man in the 18th century. They probably let it ferment, they ran it through twice, and they went, that's good enough, take it into town. So I don't think they calibrated it, but I would bet it would. I know there was two types, double distilled and quadruple distilled. So I think we always talk about the double distilled being between 80 and 90 proof probably, and the quadruple distilled, which was called rectified whiskey, was approaching 120s, we think.
This is for Bill. I love the Port City name. Did you consider other names? Any history to picking this great name?
Thank you. The name Port City is a tribute to the heritage of Alexandria. I'm a lifelong Alexandrian. I grew up here. My family's been in Alexandria for over 100 years. My great-grandfather moved here in 1908 to work in Potomac Yard. So there was never any question where the brewery was going to be. The name Port City, and Alexandria being a city that's steeped in such history, I wanted the brewery to reflect that. And so that's why I chose the name Port City. Fortunately, the name was available. My wife is a trademark lawyer, and so we get very good trademark advice. And fortunately, that name was available, and it is a registered trademark of our company. But as far as other names, that's really the name that was always the working name of the brewery. And so I didn't really consider. I wanted there to be history, and I wanted there to be texture to our brand. And I thought that naming it after a place would be a good way to do that.
And I think it's great you chose that because there is a link between what we both do, and that without Alexandria, the port, Washington wouldn't have made money in the variety of things that he did. And now today with the distillery and what you're doing, this is supporting a great business as it has since the 18th century.
There is a lot of interest in apple cider in this audience. We have 4 questions about cider. Steve, I believe you made an apple brandy at the distillery recently. Do you plan to do this annually? And could you talk a bit about Washington's use of the apple to make alcohol?
Yeah, in a lot of going back in English history and European history, apples were critical to many farms, and hard cider was really a very important part of life. And so most farmers made cider, and Washington did as well. And at the distillery, the late 1790s, he made apple and peach brandy, small amounts. The apple brandy he chose, which was typical for people making it, certain apples are good to eat, and others are not so good for eating. You bite into that. And those were the apples like Roxbury russets that they would press into cider, or in his case, run it through the stills. So we have made apple brandy and the peach brandy, and we probably plan on doing a brandy every year, just alternate apple and peach is what our current plan is. That got a little interrupted this off-season because we got contacted by Jim Beam Suntory, and they want to do a special distillation with us and our team in September, which is when I was going to do the apple brandy. So we're going to have to see what we do, but it sold really well, and now that means we've completed all the products that Washington has made there. So I think more coming. Yeah.
Well, here's a different slant. Does Virginia law encourage or discourage craft beer brewing or whiskey distilling? What about Alexandria regulations?
That's a good question. And the beer business, as the distilling business, very highly regulated, highly taxed industries. We're regulated at the federal level, we're regulated at the state level, and we're regulated, and the city of Alexandria is also interested in our business as well. So we have a lot of compliance that we have to do. The state of Virginia, they've come a long way as far as kind of recognizing the value of craft breweries to communities, and they've amended the laws recently to make it more friendly for small breweries. I think what got the attention of our former governor was when Sierra Nevada from California and Oscar Blues and New Belgium all were looking to open an East Coast plant. They looked at Virginia and they looked at North Carolina. They all chose North Carolina. And that got the attention of our former governor. He's like, well, why is everybody going to North Carolina? And there were certain laws that North Carolina had enacted that Virginia had not, that made North Carolina a better place to open a brewery. And so in 2012, the ABC law was changed to allow craft breweries to serve beer on premise in our tasting rooms, whereas before we could only offer little 4-ounce samples, which is what we did, and it was great, but sometimes you just want a beer. You don't want a 4-ounce sample.
What do you mean sometimes?
So in July of 2012, that law went into effect, and our business literally doubled overnight in the tasting room. And the tasting room has evolved since then. It's now become a real community gathering spot. It's busy every single day of the week. We've got 2 flat screen TVs, so people come and hang out and watch the game. We've opened up a second bar to serve our customers. We have picnic tables that we put out in the brewery when we get really busy, and that also attracted the food trucks to come as well. So the state of Virginia is starting to recognize that they need to do things to be more, to change. The laws were just outdated, and they just needed to be updated as the beer culture is changing. The laws need to change with that as well. In the city of Alexandria, it was interesting when we were getting our permits, we would go down to City Hall and talk to them, and there's no business like ours in the city at the time. And we would tell them that we're opening a brewery. They'd be like, oh, okay, well, you need to go talk to the health department and get your health permit over there. And I would go to the health department, and they're like, well, you're not a restaurant. I'm like, no, I'm not a restaurant. And they said, okay, well, you don't need to talk to me. You need to go back down to the city. So it was an education process where we had to remind the city officials that were regulating us what we are and what we're not, what we're going to look like, what we're going to have in our facility, and what we're not going to have in our facility. And so they were very cooperative. It was just a matter of educating them as to what we were going to look like and what we were actually going to be doing at our facility.
And Mount Vernon had help too with our state representative when we were building the distillery. Even though we didn't plan initially to produce a lot, as I said, we thought, let's go ahead and get the license, because if we ever decided to go forward, we'd be prepared. But as I said earlier, George Washington opens a lot of doors for us. So if you read our license, it says, on a certain plantation between this road and this road, you can be a producer, a bottler, but also a retail sales point. And that was the key thing for us. So our little gift shop by the mill and the main gift shop at the estate are both ABC stores. So that's the one unique thing about our operation. For most other distilleries, it has to go to, in Virginia's case, the state-run ABC store.
What's a good cocktail for George Washington's rye?
Well, the original Manhattan was made with rye. And it's really interesting how rye has had a resurgence in the market. I mean, it's funny if you've know the story of whiskey. Really, what crushed a lot of the old good brands was Prohibition. And then after Prohibition, people's taste had changed. And you see the growth of bourbon, whiskey, and corn liquor. And by the 1960s and 70s, rye was really fading, and it was kind of your granddad's drink, you know. And if you've seen that rye on the market, Old Overholt, I believe, the joke then was Old Overcoat. You know, it was just, and then I attribute some of this to Mount Vernon's story in George Washington, is that the idea of rye whiskey started to come back. The other thing I'd recommend is, maybe I can get it to some of you to distribute. Someone's done research on a punch from the 18th century that uses rye. It's kind of interesting. So as people are going back to traditional food, traditional grains, they're also going back into traditional beer and cocktail culture. So, but I would say today, try a Manhattan with some rye and see if you like that.
All right. What marketing strategy has been the most successful for Port City?
Our marketing strategy has been really just face-to-face, hand-to-hand combat. Just being out in the market, being very visible, talking to restaurants and bars and telling them what we're doing, inviting people to the brewery, and bringing samples with us and letting people taste the beer. It's been very simple strategy, but it's something that's authentic, and it's something that people can relate to. It's really just meeting people and being visible in the market. And this is what I learned from the Mondavi family, working with them for over 12 years, just being out in the market, being relevant in the market, and talking to buyers and helping them understand why they should have our beer. It also, you know, if you look at craft beer in general, this is not something that is driven by really marketing campaigns. We don't use television advertising. We don't do sponsor sporting events. We don't have a NASCAR team. We don't do any of the things that the big brewers do to sell their beer. Our marketing is consumer driven. It's flavor driven. And it's driven by beer that is more complex and more interesting. And what I like to think, it's more pleasing. It tastes better. And that's what's driving it. And Sherry mentioned earlier that she thinks most of the restaurants in Alexandria have our beer. It's true, and people want authentic products these days. They want to know who's growing their vegetables. They want to know who's growing their meat, and they want to know who's making their beer and wine and whiskey. So there's a real connection there that people want to have with the people that make their food and drink today, and that's something that I think is a good thing. Craft beer is going from national brands more to regionalism. People want to support local and regional businesses, and our plan is not to become anything more than a mid-Atlantic brewery that's based here in Alexandria. Our advertising budget is exactly zero and has been since the day we opened, and it's really just because of our plan is very different, of just meeting people, being with people when they drink the beer, and helping them understand why they need to have it.
Well, that's great to hear that, because that speaks to the quality of the craft part of it, of what you're doing, and people like it. Because a couple people tonight we talked about wine at dinner and things, and you know, I don't know a lot about wine at all, and you sometimes feel, well, how do I know what's really good? And one of the distillers we worked with made a great statement one day when we were working. He said, "If you like it, it's good." You know, and I think sometimes the ends of, what are the in crowd doing? Well, if it's good to you, enjoy it, and you've obviously hit the mark.
Thanks.
Well, now here's a question, sort of a technical question. Compare, please, the ease or lack of ease of making whiskey, beer, wine.
Well, they both start as beer, don't they?
Yes.
You know, you complete it through the fermentation, and
Right.
and that's where the difference is. He doesn't run through a copper pot, so that's where you take that fermented. It's called a distiller's beer at that point for me, and it runs through the copper still. And I think the other difference, which we alluded to, is I think you have a lot of pumps and pipes at your place, and that makes everything easier, because if you go visit his brewery or a modern distillery, all that mash we move, it's through pipes and hoses, and the distiller's sitting at a keyboard where he can control the temperature in the still and track everything mechanically and electronically. In Washington's time, it was just everything else had to be bucketed. So, but maybe you can speak about wine a little more.
Yeah, well, the process that you described, Steve, of distiller's beer, the beginning of that process is exactly the same, of making the mash, fermenting the mash, and then we'll just let it ferment out, and then we'll package it, and it's done. But if you compare what we do to what the big brewers do, and even what some larger craft brewers do, we really do have a lot of manual processes at our brewery. All of our valves, the brewer has to move by hand. Now, we do have sophisticated technology in the brewery. I mentioned Dr. Lang, who runs our lab, and she runs our quality control. And so we have very advanced analysis of the beer and a lot of technology in the brewery, but the process itself is managed by people. So the brewer is manually turning the hoses, he's manually turning the valves, hooking up the hoses, and moving the beer from point to point, whereas more technologically advanced, more mechanized breweries, I like to joke that some craft brewers, you can go into their brewery and push the big green button that says "Make beer," and walk away and come back 6 hours later. Our brewery is not like that, and we did that by design. We could have spent the money on that extra mechanized approach, but our brewers wanted to have their hands in every step of the way. Even our bottling line is. We do 60 bottles a minute on our line, which may sound like it's kind of fast to do one bottle every second, but we're still loading the bottles on by hand, and we're loading them off by hand when they come off the bottling line. We put them into the 6-packs and cases manually. So that's something that's a lot of fun as well. Everybody has images of Laverne and Shirley or I Love Lucy at the end of the bottling line. So,
Well, how do you control the alcohol content of your beer? What part is it where you pull it out of the fermentation as to how strong it is?
yeah, the alcohol is controlled first by the amount of sugar that's the starch and sugar that's in the mash, and where you stop the fermentation. Most of our beers are fermented dry, which means that we ferment out all of the residual sugar, and so the resulting beer is dry, similar, just like a wine would be dry. It means it has no residual sugar left in it. And you do that by controlling the amount of sugar that you start with, and also by the fermentation. If you want a little bit of residual sweetness in the beer, then you can stop the fermentation before it's completely done and leave a little bit of sugar in it.
Interesting.
Bill, what is the biggest quality control challenge in the brewery?
It's air. The biggest quality control challenge is oxygen. Oxygen is the enemy of fermenting beer. It's the enemy of finished beer. And this is something that I had to learn coming from the wine business. Wine is much more stable than beer is. And beer, where wine can age, beer just goes stale. And so beer needs to be consumed as freshly as possible. And we go to great lengths to keep oxygen out of our beer. Every time you move a beer from one tank to the other, there's the potential to pick up oxygen, and that's going to make the beer go stale. It's going to lower the quality. And so we go to great lengths to keep air out. In fact, we have a tank that our brewer Jonathan invented. It's called the Hopzooka. And this is a tank that we wanted, and most craft brewers will do a process called dry hopping, which is adding more hops to the beer while it's fermenting. You'll do this to your pale ale, we do it to our IPA, and the beers that are hoppy. It adds more flavor, it adds a lot of aroma to the beer, but the way most microbreweries add hops to the beer is the brewer climbs to the top of the tank, opens up the hatch, and dumps a bucket of hops in, which is a fine way to get the hops into the beer, but the problem is when you open that tank, you're letting air into it, and you're degrading the quality of the beer. So Jonathan's solution to that problem was this tank that he designed that is a pressure vessel, and it's on wheels, and we add the hops to this tank, and we purge out all of the oxygen with our CO2 supply, and then we pressurize that tank with more CO2, and then we roll it over to the tank that we want to add the hops to and hook it up to the vent arm of the tank, open up the valve, and it shoots the hops up to the top of the tank in a closed loop process that's powered by CO2. So we're getting virtually zero oxygen pickup through our hop addition. And it's through this innovation that Jonathan came up with. And we've applied for a patent on the technology because it's an innovation that improves the quality of our beer and stabilizes it and gives us a longer shelf life.
Now, in beer history, hoppy beer was also an antibacterial for people, too. You know,
Yes.
you think of the water people were scared of drinking over the centuries, so a lot of those early beers were high hop content, right?
Yeah, the hop content acted as a preservative, keeping it fresh, and also just making it last longer and making it safer. I mean, people drank whiskey, cider, and wine and beer because the water was not safe.
Yeah, in the 18th century, on average, men drank 3.7 more times than they do today. So, you know, think of the market today. Maybe that explains the debates in Congress in the 18th century.
Steve, here's a question about competition in George Washington's time. What was the competitive landscape like for George Washington? Who else was brewing, and who were the buyers?
Well, again, I think the film mentions that in about 1800, there were 3,500 distilleries in Virginia and Maryland in this area. So gives you an idea that there's a huge competition, you'd say, but obviously he was able to sell 11,000 gallons right here close to home. So I think as much as they could make, they sold. And that's what Colonel Fitzgerald, who he wrote to when the idea came upon him from Anderson, you know, should I build this distillery? Fitzgerald replied that if you make good whiskey, it'll sell. And the biggest buyer here was George Gilpin, right here in Alexandria. In 1798, he bought, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 gallons on consignment. 1799, he buys 4,000 gallons outright. So that told you that was moving through the taverns and people here in Alexandria. So I think Washington, again, was perfectly positioned. You know, that river that fed Alexandria fed his plantation as a transportation artery, and the people of Alexandria, you know, bought up the whiskey rapidly. So there's a great letter that the Distilled Spirits Council bought, a George Washington letter, and sometimes we get it on display. And Washington writes a friend and says, "Business is brisk at my new distillery."
Bill, you said Jonathan has carte blanche to buy whatever ingredients and from anywhere in the world that he wants to. What are some of those exotic ingredients?
It's mainly hops and grain. The base malt that we use is a Pilsner malt, and that comes to us from Canada. And it's at 32 cents a pound. It's among the most expensive strains of barley in the world. And of course, it's among the highest quality as well. We order that 40,000 pounds at a time. So it's a full truckload that comes to us about once a month, and it goes into our grain silo that sits in our parking lot. And the grain silo has a capacity of 56,000 pounds. And so we're filling that tank up once a month. So that's one. We also use, like I said, we use British hops. There's a strain of hops called Fuggles that goes into our porter. We use the American hops we use are Citra hops, Centennial hops, Columbus hops, Amarillo. These are all different strains of American hops that are very aromatic. They have a lot of kind of pine and citrus character, and that's what gives our IPA that real fresh, hoppy character.
You said that micro brewers have 8% of the U.S. overall market. Why so low? What's the growth rate? What's the cap?
That's a good question, and that's a question that we discuss, the Brewers Association, which we're a member of. We discuss that every year at the Craft Brewers Conference, and so we're 8% of the market. Why are we so low? Well, only 8% of the market isn't very high, but the reason that we're so low is that in the 1970s, there were only 79 breweries in the United States. 79. Before Prohibition, there were, I think, around 2,000 breweries in the U.S., and back then, all beer was local because you couldn't ship beer very far. There was no mechanical refrigeration, and as I mentioned earlier, beer likes to go stale. So all beer was local, and it didn't ship very far, and so every village had a brewery. That was great. You had regional styles, and if you tasted a beer out west, you wouldn't have that same style of beer on the East Coast. And then as the big brewers took over after Prohibition, and we only had 79 breweries in the United States, you can imagine the homogenization of flavor. Everything became Pilsner. Everything became light lager. And that's really was what I consider the low point of American brewing. We now have 3,200 breweries in the U.S., which I think is pretty exciting. That's the most breweries that we've ever had in the U.S., and at 8% market share, that's the biggest that our industry has ever been. If you look at beer in America, it's flat, it's in decline. The big brewers are losing, they're losing volume at 1% a year. And if 1% doesn't sound like a lot, consider that Anheuser-Busch brews about 100 million barrels a year. Well, 1% of that, that's a lot of beer that they're losing. Is it due to craft beer? Partially. It's also due to the fact that people are just drinking less overall, and people are drinking higher quality, so that's a part of it. But they're also losing volume to imports as well. The bright side is that we're only 8% of the market. So there's a lot of opportunity there. We get new people into the brewery all the time. There's new people discovering more flavorful beers every single day, and that to me is exciting. And how far can it go, I think, was the other part of the question. We don't know. We do not know. The Brewers Association, we estimate that we think we can get to 20% by 2020, and we seem to be on track to be able to do that. I go to the Craft Brewers Conference every year and talk to the economists and talk to the forecasters and listen to what they have to say, and they're looking for clouds on the horizon and what's going to go wrong with this craft beer boom. And nobody knows where it's going to go. We don't know. I think 20% is achievable, and I think that I certainly think we'll get there. People say that 3,200 breweries, that's too many breweries in the U.S. Well, how do you know? If and people talk about, is there a beer bubble right now? And I think that's kind of over-analyzing it. There's 7,000 wineries in the U.S., and no one talks about whether there's a wine bubble. And, just here locally, if a new burger joint opens up, you don't hear people talking about a burger bubble. You just hear people say, hey, great, let's go get a burger. Let's go try the new place out. So we don't know where it's going to end up.
Well, and here's someone saying, when initial public offering?
We are a very small company. It's my wife and I started the company. We've got a few partners. The bank has a big part of the brewery, and we turned a profit in our second year of business, which we're pretty happy with, and we've been able to sustain that and keep it going. Rather than think about an IPO, we need more local breweries. So if anybody's looking to make some investment, go invest in a local brewery, because we need more around here. The more the merrier. I like to tell people that if one guy has an antique store, he's just a crazy guy on the corner selling junk. But if you got 10 antique stores in a row, then you have a district, and then you have a destination, and people will come to this destination for antiques. And you can do the same thing with craft beer. Places like Denver, places like Seattle, certainly Portland, Oregon, San Diego, even Philadelphia, closer to home, have thriving craft beer scenes. And the more that open, the better everybody does. So I'm looking for more breweries to open up and make this a better market overall.
Steve, can you talk to us a little bit about the Whiskey Rebellion?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot, because everybody knows how cynical we all can get, and of course in our country today there's a lot of cynicism, but a lot of people will ask, well, so Washington as president put down the whiskey rebels because he wanted to corner the market and be a big distiller. Well, the Whiskey Rebellion happened in early 1790s. Really the origins of it in 1791, when Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, told Washington the best way to pay our war debt and the collected debt of all the states was to levy a tax on spirits. And Washington agreed, because he realized, we have to deal with the debt. But the problem for people on the western frontier of Pittsburgh and parts of North Carolina and Virginia was the way the law was written and implemented. For instance, if you are a small distiller and you didn't register your still after the law was passed, and there was a case where a man was stopped in his field while harvesting grain, told he had an illegal still, and he had to pay the fine in cash and then go to court. The court was in Philadelphia. He's out in western Pennsylvania. This caused a lot of animosity because whiskey on the frontier was your cash. Where are you going to get the cash? That's why you're making it. You could barter with that, trade with that. That was legal tender. So that was the first problem. The second problem was the way the tax was designed was that big distillers were taxed at this capacity of their stills. And so really the small distiller was getting hit at 9 cents a gallon, whereas the big distiller could just make more, and his effective tax went down. And so the other thing that comes into it, though, that's the rebels' point of view. For George Washington to have a bunch of people on the frontier of a young country talking about joining with the British and the French and opening up the frontier to the Mississippi River so they can ship their goods that way, using the language of the French Revolution about overthrow, from a presidential perspective, he couldn't tolerate that. And so that's why he put together an army of about 10 to 12,000 men, led out there part of the way to western Pennsylvania, along with Light Horse Harry Lee, the governor of Virginia, Robert E. Lee's father. And they put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And that amount of troops, it's interesting to note, is more troops than Washington had under his own personal command at any time during the Revolution. So for him, it was to make an example that you have to pay your taxes, you have to abide by the law. For the people in the West, they had a valid grievance that, we'll pay our taxes, but it's implementation, it's onerous. And so they amended the law to where you could go to local court, you didn't have to pay in cash. It got modified. But after a lot of people were injured, and of course tax collectors were killed, and the tarring and feathering of people went on. And it's interesting that about 25 people were arrested and tried. Washington pardoned most of them. So it was really kind of let's make example of this. And then, of course, a lot of those people just moved to Kentucky and Tennessee. And you get a little further away from the government, and that's the origins of the industry there. So again, there's no connection for Washington other than his role as president and what he felt was right. And he did not even know who James Anderson, the Scottish man he would hire years later, was. So when Washington builds the distillery, I think I mentioned, he paid his taxes, and we have those records at Mount Vernon showing how much tax he paid on his still house. So again, people, I think we all tend to think, oh, he was trying to corner a market. Well, there's nothing to that.
Bill, can you tell us about your derecho beer?
Yes. Who was here the summer of 2012 when the big derecho storm barreled through here, and whose lights went out? Yeah. The storm that blew through here in the summer of 2012 was called a derecho. And before that storm happened, I don't think anybody had ever heard that word before. I certainly hadn't. But we all certainly knew what it was after the storm. But what happened was we had brewed the last batch of our summer lager on June 29th, 2012. We brewed it that day. It was a Friday. And we finished the brew. The beer was bubbling away in the tank, and everything was great. And so the brewers all went home on Friday night, and at 10:30, that windstorm kicked up and came barreling through the D.C. area and knocked everybody's power out. There were 1 million people in the D.C. area that lost electricity, and we were one of them at the brewery. And our power was out for 5 days. And that tank of beer that was fermenting, we couldn't keep it cold without electricity. This was a lager beer, so it's supposed to ferment out at about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And without power, we couldn't control the temperature of the tank. Fermenting beer gives off heat, and so it wants to warm up. And even though we had glycol-insulated tanks, without power to circulate the glycol, they don't work. So we had 13,000 gallons of beer fermenting in the brewery that day. And we didn't know what was going to happen. We had only been open for a year, and we thought this could be the end of us if we lost 13,000 gallons of beer. That was everything we had. So we tested the beer. We were checking it, sampling it, taking the temperature of it, and putting it under a microscope and looking at it and seeing if anything was growing in it. And it turned out that 5 of our 6 tanks were okay. They had all gone through primary fermentation, and they were stabilized. That 6th tank, the beer that we had brewed the day before, was not stable. It was fermenting actively, and it was warming up. And it wasn't 40 degrees anymore. It was 50 degrees, and then it was 55 degrees, and then it was 60 degrees. And that beer ended up fermenting out at about 65 degrees. That's not where a lager beer is supposed to ferment, 40 degrees. And so that difference in temperature changes the character of the beer significantly. And even then, we didn't know what was going to happen, if we were going to lose that beer or not. Well, through testing the beer and tasting it and checking it very avidly, we determined that the beer was okay, but it was no longer a lager. But what it had turned into was a beer that's made in California intentionally that way. There's a style of beer called California Common, which is lager yeast that's fermented at high temperatures. That beer was developed in San Francisco, and the best known example of it is Anchor Steam. And San Francisco, the air is always 55 degrees, and so the beer, you want to keep a lager beer cold, but it warms up to 55 and naturally ferments out, and that's how that beer developed in San Francisco. And so the derecho storm had turned our lager beer into a California Common, or a steam beer, so we renamed it Derecho Common, and because we couldn't sell it as a lager beer because it didn't taste like the lager that it was supposed to. But the beer tasted good, everybody liked it, and it turned out to be the one positive thing that for a lot of people who came out of that storm. We like to joke that the derecho beer was its best enjoyed in the dark without air conditioning. That's how most of us enjoyed it. But it became a beer, it got picked up by the press. Channel 7 was there covering it, WTOP was there, the Washington Post did a big article about it. It got picked up by the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. It got picked up by the UK Guardian. So we're getting all this press on the beer, so everybody was interested in this beer, and we had one 60-barrel tank of it. Well, everybody had read about it, and so the tasting room was mobbed the day that it was the day that we released the beer, and it sold out in 2 weeks. So it became this beer that everybody had read about and that nobody got to taste. And so we brewed it again the following year because there were so many people talking about it. And since then, it's become our little summer tradition. So that's our summer seasonal. We release it on the anniversary of the derecho storm at the end of June. The beer tastes better now because we planned to brew it that way. It wasn't an accident. And if you come to the brewery on the day that we release it in the tasting room, we give everybody a little flashlight with the logo on it, a keychain flashlight that has a beer opener on it also, in case your power goes out, you can stay safe.
That's a great story.
Steve, if you cut 186 proof down to 86 with distilled water, wouldn't that also dilute the flavor?
It doesn't impact the flavor that much, no, because we cut in large batch. So it's not thinking of cutting a bottle. We've got a large tank full of all the run. And we also try to blend the whiskeys of lower proof so that we only have to add the smallest amount of DI water. And we learned that the hard way because I ran up and down Route 1 buying every distilled water there was in any store the first time we did this. Dave said, I need, 47 gallons of distilled water. And of course, okay, 12 from Safeway, I'll go down the road. So by doing it in large batch and blending the other lower proofs in the 60 range to 80 range, then we might have to add 2 or 3 gallons.
Bill, there are a couple of questions here about where to buy your beer. How many bars and restaurants carry your beers, and where do we buy your beer?
Okay. Well, the beer is available, how many? We have about 1,500 accounts, and that includes Metro New York, Maryland, D.C., Virginia, and the state of North Carolina. And that 1,500 accounts includes grocery stores, it includes bottle shops, it includes bars, restaurants, country clubs, and hotels, everywhere that sells craft beer. Locally, it's available at our tasting room. It's available at all the Total Wine stores. It's available at all the Whole Foods markets. It's available at Wegmans, Giant, Safeway. Who am I leaving out? All the independent wine and beer stores, they carry our stuff as well.
Whole Foods?
Yeah, all the Whole Foods markets. So I like to say we try to make it easy to find. And a lot of the restaurants here locally, both in DC and really all around the Beltway, will have our beer on tap as well. But the bottles are available at most of the grocery store chains and most of the independent beer stores as well.
Okay, 2 last questions. First, Steve, is the video presentation that was here tonight, is that online from Mount Vernon?
Yeah, mountvernon.org. There's the distillery page, and that video's there. And also some other, I didn't mention too much about the grist mill, the water-powered mill. There's some videos there about its operation. And that's the other aspect that we do that no one else does, is all the rye, corn, and malt is ground by water power on millstones before we take it to the distillery. So A couple years back, we were doing one of our runs in November, and the retail shop was bothering me because they needed grits. And so for the first time since 1799, both buildings were in production at the same time, which made us feel really good. So 5 still's running, and the grist mill was putting out product at the same time. So, but check the website, and if you're interested in the product, there's a list on the distillery page where you can add your email, and you'll get an email blast when the sale dates for the brandies and the whiskeys, because it's never the same date. It depends on when we finish and when we can bottle. So that's a good way to know when things are available.
Bill, what is your favorite Port City brew?
My favorite Port City brew. My favorite Port City brew is my next Port City brew. I do get that question a lot, and the proper thing to say is that I can't pick a favorite. It's like picking a favorite child. But I do have a favorite beer. I drink more of our Monumental IPA, which is our flagship IPA, than any of our other beers. And that's just my personal preference. That's the style of beer that I like the most. It's the style of beer that I drink the most of. And I'm probably aligned with many craft beer drinkers because IPA, or India Pale Ale, is the #1 selling style of craft beer in America. That beer is the beer for me that really got me into craft beer 20 plus years ago, but it was Sierra Nevada Pale Ale was kind of the beer that the light bulb went off for me. So that's still, to this day, it's one of my favorite beers that's not one of ours. I also drink a lot of Bell's Two Hearted from Michigan, which I think is among the finest IPAs in the country, along with ours.
Well, maybe as we talked when we had a meal, there might be one more beer in the future, which we discussed. Is I wonder what one of your beers aged in used Mount Vernon rye whiskey barrels might taste like.
We'll have to find out. That would be cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Steve and Bill. This has been fascinating. And a big round of applause also to Russ, Rosalind, and Sherry for putting together this wonderful panel. I was doing a little research getting ready for today's event, and I found a toast offered by George Washington, not in Alexandria, but at the Francis Tavern in New York. It was kind of a tradition after the Revolutionary War to have toasts for peace and freedom, and you would offer 13 toasts for the 13 new states. So George Washington began his toast with, "To the United States of America." He followed toasting the countries who had been our allies, the American Army, and he finished with, "May the remembrances of this day be a lesson to princes." May this day be a day we all remember. Thank you so much, and have a good evening. See you next month.
Way to take that Horatio storm and turn it into gold. It's great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sure.
Okay. Oh, cool. Is that right? That's great. That keeps growing too.
Yeah, it's all growing, and it's all that synergy,
Yeah, for sure.